workers and those who were silk workers rather than cotton hose workers tend to be better paid. Now, I don't think that is entirely convincing because, as various parliamentary commissions, William Felkin, Nottinghamshire Hosey, an unrivalled authority on framework knitting, makes clear, there are wide frames, the obnoxious frames producing cheap cut-up goods in Nottingham, and most of those villages also have traditional narrow frames making real quality hosiery goods. So I think that in like many people, they were too keen to be attacking E.P. Thompson, and I think that they slightly exaggerated that geographical split of the hosiery trade. You can't simply reduce it to the fact that, oh look, there are more poor people in the villages, that's why there's more frame breaking. Another fact, I think, is, which is undeniable, is that trades unionism is much weaker in those villages than it is in the town. Gravener Henson and those with him who go to London to try and persuade Parliament to introduce protective legislation for the framework knitters complain about the framework knitters in the villages for being seemingly uninterested in this parliamentary campaign. Now, to be fair to the village knitters, you can't really blame them, because one of the delegates from Basford writes back to Henson and says, well, one of the reasons we're not really interested is because the delegation that's gone to London is dominated by people who work in the lace and silk branches. The nice elite branches in Nottingham, the sort of coarser branches that are concentrated in the village, are not as represented on that parliamentary committee. There's a nice quote which I found in Thompson this morning, actually making a similar point, when one of Henson's accomplices, Thomas Large, writes of his experience of trying to generate enthusiasm in the villages for the parliamentary campaign going on. And he says, let me find it. I have been out 2 days and could not get 1 penny. They look pleasant as a cow husband at me. Which, of course, again, is an elitist kind of view amongst those more skilled knitters about their brethren in the villages. But I think the problem, it seems to me, about a lot of Nottinghamshire Luddism is that it's been written through the eyes of people like Gravener Henson. And it reminds me a lot about what Malcolm has said recently about histories of Chartism that focus on the London Working Men's Association. In focusing on Gravener Henson and those group of elite skilled workers, you really are focusing on a very narrow and unrepresentative sample of the wider body of people who make up the framework knitting trade, and of course who are the Luddites. You might be thinking then, well, what is the explanation for why there is more frame breaking in the villages? The answer, it seems to me, as we've already heard from Boosey's friend, is the greater concentration of the forces of law and order in Nottinghamshire. And this is a massive depletion of force, and it makes me, as I'll go on to say in a moment, very sceptical of those accounts which have suggested Nottinghamshire in Luddism was not violent. Nottinghamshire in Luddism was moderate. Luddism in Nottinghamshire was a much more retiring affair and didn't involve all these great big events like we've heard about at Rawfolds, or possibly not, or other places. By the beginning of December 1811, the watch and ward system in Nottingham and around had been overhauled, and applications to Parliament for powers to expand that system had been granted. Curfew had been introduced in the town and the villages, not allowed to be out after 10 o'clock at night. 400 special constables had been sworn in, raised to 600 a month later. The entire force of yeomanry had been called out on the 14th of November. 2 regular militia and 10 troops of regular horse guard were also stationed in or near Nottingham. A total force of 1,000 infantry and between 800 and 900 cavalry, all placed under the command of General Dyett, commander of the Lichfield district, who during the real sort of turbulent period goes to Nottingham to assume command himself. By the end of December, a further infantry regiment had been brought in, and by February 1812, of course, Diet had been replaced by the much more active and zealous General Hawker. This moved Frank Darvel, still one of the greatest historians, I think, certainly of Luddism in the East Midlands, to move that this was a tremendous force, totalling nearly 4,000. Even Richard Ryder, the ineffectual Home Secretary, not much moved to sort of making exaggerated comments. He notes that this, quote, is a larger force than had ever been before necessary for the quelling of any local disturbances. Small wonder that almost immediately after the magistrates have secured this, who of course have been writing several letters daily begging for this, the questions start: who is going to pay for this? By the spring of 1812, of course, frame breaking had been made a capital offence, and the first set of Luddites had been tried at the Lent Assizes, and 7 were transported. By contrast, the point I'm making here is that by the time this has happened, frame breaking has become a very dangerous enterprise indeed in Nottingham itself. In the surrounding villages, by contrast, despite the posting of small detachments of troops in the villages, the Luddites were still striking with virtual immunity. The Duke of Newcastle informed Ryder that, quote, although there was a large military force in the country, the local police were so defective that the military was unable to render much assistance. Similarly, another magistrate, George Sculthorpe, tells the Home Office that the disturbances have at present prevailed chiefly in the county, because the population being there dispersed, the property cannot be so well defended. Now, I mentioned to you that I'm not entirely convinced by this account of Nottinghamshire Luddism not being very violent. Let me give you some examples of what we're talking about. Not only were frames broken violently, but windows were smashed, doors kicked in, blows were exchanged, cottages and workshops plundered with residents held at gunpoint, hosiers were sent threatening letters, police and soldiers were threatened and attacked, a number of highway robberies were committed in the name of Ned Ludd, often at gunpoint, and, as the county magistrate William Sherbrooke noted, contributions are levied round the county under the influences of menaces to the lives and property of individuals. That same day, Sherbrooke again wrote to the Duke of Newcastle and said, the mob is now so organised that nothing but military placed in every parish will be adequate to suppress it. And by the beginning of the new year, the Duke of Newcastle, Lord Lieutenant I should add, was telling the Home Office similar things. He says, people are now never safe in their homes, and robberies and some attempts to murder are constantly taking place. Indeed, Newcastle continued, and this is against what we really know about Newcastle, without being an alarmist, I am of opinion that the present state of the county is calculated to excite the most nervous apprehensions for the consequences which may avail. Now, such incidences as these are common in the first phase of Luddism. Midlands Luddism may have lacked the dramatic equivalent of Rawfolds Mill, though the attack on Heathcote and Bobbin's lace mill at Loughborough in 1816 surely comes close. A young Luddite by the name of John Wesley, the surname differs depending on where you look, was shot by one hosier whose frames Wesley was attacking. Wesley subsequently died of his injuries and was poignantly found on Bulwell Forest the next morning. There was the attempted assassination of Nottingham hosier William Trenton. The Midlands may not have hosted a special commission for trying Luddites, but it did have high-profile trials, notably at the Nottingham Lent Assizes in 1812, where 7 men were found guilty and transported, and of course the more famous Assizes at Leicester in 1816 that tried James Toll and his conspirators for their attack on the Loughborough Mill. Now, in the final section of the paper, I want to talk to you about really the research that I've been doing very recently, which has been on the framework knitters in the villages surrounding Nottinghamshire. And it does seem to me then that when you add up the fact that trade unionism is weak, that we are still talking about a predominantly rural society, that it makes little sense